Hello everyone, my name is Michael McCann and welcome to part 4 of this Wayward Art Company tutorial for creating a character in Blender 2.77. Sorry that this has taken me a bit of time to do, but I'm just recovering from a cold, so again my sincerest apologies. But where last we left off, we had just created the texture for texture painting, but now we're going to go to CG textures and actually look for our textures to paint onto our character. So at CG Textures, I'm going to go to Animals, and then click on Fur. And the ringtail is sort of a golden brown, so it looks like there's actually a lot of options here. This one looks pretty good. We'll just scroll down and see what else we have. Okay, so I think I'm going to select this one. And I'll download the low quality version of it. Now I also want a lighter fur and a darker fur to use just for contrast. So this one looks good for our light fur. And then lastly, I'll choose like a dark brown. Looks like they almost kind of group these by color, which is kind of helpful. Okay, so this will work for the dark brown. And so now we can go into Gimp and edit them. Okay, so I'm going to click on this little knife tab, which is the crop tool, and then just choose the selection that I like. And this doesn't have to be completely even on both sides. I just like to make it completely square. But again, that's not necessary. And then I can finalize that with Enter. Okay, so now I can go to Filters and then Map and choose Make Seamless, which of course makes it a seamless texture. It doesn't do the best job of making seamless textures, but for our purposes it would be good. We certainly couldn't do like a brick texture or something more complex, but for texture painting this will be good. So I'm just going to overwrite that file. You could save it as you could export it as a different image if you wanted, but I'm just going to overwrite them. So now I can just drag the second texture in, and it's asking me to convert to something or another. I don't really know why certain textures do that and some do not, but I always just click convert. So now, again, the same process, just choosing an area that I like and making it sort of square. Okay, and then I can press Enter. Then Filters, Map, Make Seamless. And now that I'm looking at this, it still looks a little dark to me. So I'm going to lighten it up. I can just go to Colors, and there's a few options here, but I'm going to use Curves. So I can just bend the curve up a little, and that lightens up the whole texture. And I think that will work well. So now I'll just overwrite that image. And then finally our third texture, which was the dark one. Do the same thing, just crop out an area. And now that I'm looking at this one looks a bit too light, so I'll probably do the same thing I did with the last texture using curves, but this time I'm going to darken it instead of brighten it. So I'll just go to Colors and Curves, and now bend the curve downward to darken it up a bit. And now Filters, Map, Make Seamless. Okay, so now we have all of the textures that we need to start texture painting. Okay, so now back in Blender, I'm going to go to my default view. And I'm still in Blender Render in the internal engine. I'm just going to add a new material. And so now we need to apply the texture to it that we created at the end of part 3. So I'll click on the texture tab, and then under type I'll choose image or movie, and under coordinates I'll choose UV, and then here I can select that character texture. And now switch from solid view to textured view, and I can see that texture applied, but I still need to do one more thing. If I press N to bring up my options, I can switch the shading type to GLSL. And now when I paint, I'll be able to see the texture being applied. Okay, so now we're going to just import all of those textures that we edited in Gimp just by opening them in new texture slots, which, you can see it applies it to the whole model, but you can just deselect it here. Now open a new one, import the second texture, deselect it, and then finally that third one. Okay, and I'll just deselect that one and then make sure that my first texture is selected. And then go back to the UV editing. And I'll switch this to texture paint mode. And I want to, in my UV window, also switch from view to paint, so that we can paint right over the UVs as well as on the model itself. And now under my textures here, I have all 3 of those textures that I imported. And so I'm going to use the first texture that I downloaded from CG Textures, that golden color, as sort of the base. So I can just paint over all of the UVs right on the texture itself to sort of get things started quickly. Maybe increase the size of my brush a little. And that's maybe a little big, so I'll just lower the size and take the opacity all the way up. Okay, so that looks better. And I'm making sure to go outside of the lines a little because I don't want there to be any seams. Not that they'll be very noticeable, again, because we're adding hair particles to this. So, and you might be wondering why I'm even painting the model with a hair texture if we're just going to be giving it hair strands. But the reason is because when you use a texture like this and then add a particle system to it, the color of each individual hair strand will be the color of the pixel that it's emitted from or near. So the result is something that looks, much more natural than just painting it all one color or giving it a material that's all just one color. Whereas, textures have hundreds or thousands of different colored pixels in them. So it definitely looks a lot more natural to use a texture. Okay, so now all of the parts of the mesh that have that texture are painted as sort of like just a base, sort of a foundation to start working from. But I can X out that texture and just give my brush an off-white color. And I'm going to start painting some of the other parts of the mesh, like the teeth and the inside of the mouth. So I'll start with the teeth. Just take my brush size down. And this is why I unwrapped these all together. It's so much easier just to paint a little square and get all of those UVs at once. And I've been thinking a lot about character models, and I know like when you, for instance, import a make human model into Blender, I think that the mouth is actually a separate object, or it's a separate part of the mesh. I don't know, actually. I can't remember. I know that it has its own texture. Um, so, I don't really know the benefits of keeping it separate. I mean, certainly the mouth and the teeth and tongue, they don't really take up a lot of texture space. So again, like I don't really know if what the benefit is in keeping it separate, but I keep it all in the same texture, all on the same mesh. But right now I'm just painting the gums, sort of a pinkish color. I didn't go too pink. It's more of like a darker, like a mauve color. And I can do the same thing for the tongue. Maybe I'll make it slightly a different color from the gums. Okay, a bit brighter. Okay, and I'll darken this up a little more, maybe make it a little duller. And this will be the inside of the mouth. So the tongue is going to get a little bit of a bump map, but the inside of the mouth I'm just going to be sticking with a simple color. There won't be any additional detail in the texture painting itself, although it'll probably be part of a separate material that's glossy. Okay, so now I'm going to select this tab down here, which is face selection, masking for painting. And so now I can just select the tail, and this will allow me to paint only on the tail without affecting the rest of the mesh. And I'm just going to paint it white because the texture that I'm going to be putting down on top is very light. So I don't want any of that dark color from the black from the texture below showing through. Okay, and just make sure that I get this little bit, and also to go around the edges a little so that there aren't any seams. And you might be wondering why I don't just take the opacity all the way up and paint that lighter hair texture on the tail. And the reason is because the color of the hair on the tail of a ringtail is so bright that I would prefer to paint with a low opacity over top of the bright white color so that brightness really comes through. So I'll just select that light hair texture and then take the opacity down, and also enable under symmetry, I'll enable the X symmetry, so if I just paint on one side, it will paint the texture on the other side as well. And this way, again, that tail will look really bright and vibrant. Okay, now I can make the color really dark and take the opacity up and the size down. I apologize if you can hear the thunder. There's actually a really bad storm happening right now. Okay, so That looks a little light. I don't want this to be completely black, but I don't want it to look too gray either. So maybe something a little darker. I'll just take the opacity up. And I'm just going to evenly space these stripes along the tail. And I think I want these even darker, so I'll just go over them again one more time. Okay. It did leave a little gap in the front and in the back, so I can just manually paint those in. It won't look beautiful, but again, we're adding the particle system, the hair to it, so you won't even know that it's there. Alright, so now I'm going to lighten the color back up and select my original texture, the first texture that I used. And I'm going to clean up some of these areas on the model, like around the face, where it looks like the texture was stretched and it's really larger than it perhaps should be. So I'm just going to zoom in and paint the texture around the nose and the mouth. I can use my face selection tool so that I don't paint over the nose or on the teeth or the inside of the mouth. And now I can start putting some more variation into the color of the fur. So I can select this lighter fur texture. And I'll put some, like, on the chest and maybe the chin and the under the arms and the legs. So I'll just use my face masking again. And I'll just select all of the body and the head to paint on. And I'll start here under the chin. Okay, and I'll just come down to the chest. And I'm going to paint all the way down to the groin area under the legs. And just extend it all the way back to, around where the tail is. And I'll do the base of the tail. We'll blend that into the tail a little better later. Okay, so now I can maybe extend this, to the underside of the leg. And maybe it's hard to get a good angle on this, but the underside of the arm. I wish you guys could see what's happening outside right now. It's just a crazy storm. I live in Arizona, and this time of the year it's considered the monsoon season, so there are these like really intense thunderstorms that happen. Sometimes where it just rains for like an hour and just completely floods. But it's pretty pretty intense. I kind of love thunderstorms though. Okay, so I've lowered my opacity a little, and I'm just sort of blending this in a little so that those lines aren't so sharp. And of course I still have X selected under symmetry, so anything I do on one side of the body happens on the other side as well. So I'm just blending those areas where the light fur meets the dark fur. I'm just blending it together a little bit so it's not so obvious and it's more gradual. I'll do the muzzle area. I'll paint that light as well. Okay, and then let's see. We're gonna paint some more of that light color around the eyes, but let's first put some contrast down with the darker fur color. So I'll just paint around the eyes, and I still have my face masking on, so the eyelids are not selected, although I probably will paint those the same color. But I'm just adding some sort of dark contrast on the face. And it's kind of interesting when I was reading about the ringtails before I started this tutorial. They're related to raccoons, of course, which have dark circles around their eyes. Ringtails actually have light circles around their eyes. And there's an interesting biological reason for it. That, raccoons, the dark circles around their eyes basically act as like the black paint the athletes put under their eyes. It's meant to reflect light away. But the ringtail, because of being a nocturnal animal, they actually have white rings around their eyes to reflect light in, to draw light into their eyes to help them, see at night. It's pretty fascinating. So, not that really helps with this tutorial, but it's good just to understand those little details about characters, especially if you're drawing them from like an existing creature, to understand a little bit about their biology and their habits as well, to help make a more realistic character, or something that's close to simulating how the character would behave in real life. But I'm just painting over those eyelids now with the darker texture, so that it blends in a little more with the dark color we painted around the eyes. Okay, now I'll come in with the light fur. And I'm not really quite sure how the best way to do it. I think I'm just going to paint sort of a border around the eye, but not necessarily on the eyelid. So that will probably be easier to do right on the texture itself. I'll just zoom right in and just paint the circle directly over the texture itself. Okay, and of course, as the X symmetry doesn't work when you paint right over the texture itself. It only works when you paint on the actual model. So whenever you paint on the UVs or on the texture, make sure that you do both sides. Alright, and I think I want to add a little more contrast because I think that all just blends too well together. So I'm going to go back to my dark hair texture, I think, and maybe darken it up a little bit with the color, and then sort of retrace that border around the eyes and maybe that line coming from the corner of the mouth up to the muzzle or the eyes. Okay, and then just around the eyes. Okay, I like the way that looks. I just think that the darker color helps emphasize it a little more. Especially, it makes the white around the eyes stand out a bit more than it did before. So I'll just lower the opacity again and then just blend those edges together a little better. Okay, so I think now I want to lighten up some of these areas. So I'm just going to cancel the texture out, and with a really low opacity, I'm just going to paint some white over the circles around the eyes, and maybe a little bit on the chin and around the nose as well. It's basically just brightening up those areas a little more. I don't want to completely paint over the detail in the texture, but my opacity is really low, so it's essentially just adding to the brightness of the color. Okay, so now I'm going to select these faces around the mouth, and I think any of you who have dogs or cats, you probably know that there's a line around the mouth just before it meets the gums, and it's just like it's like black or it's really dark gray, and it in this case I think will add again more contrast, between the actual fur and the mouth. So I'm just going to take my opacity up and just paint this sort of light gray around the mouth. It's pretty hard to get these areas, but they won't be very visible anyway. Okay. Alright, I think that looks pretty good. And we'll probably, when we create our vertex groups, which will be the next step after we're done painting, we'll probably exclude that area from having fur on it. It's essentially the animal's lips. Now I can select the face and press H to hide it because I want to put those same borders around the eyelids. So, still using the masking, I can just select these faces right where the eyelids meet the eye, both on the top and the bottom. And I'm just going to use that same color, the grayish color. Okay, and now I'm just going to paint right on those faces. And I really think that that'll make the eyes sort of stand out a little more, maybe look a little more intense. So I can just unhide that with Alt-H. And okay. That's looking pretty good. It'll look a lot better once we add the hair, of course, but you can get some sense of what what it's going to start to look like. Now I'm just putting in a little more color variation. So I selected that original golden fur texture and just gave it a little bit of an orange or sort of pinkish hue. And I'm just painting in certain areas around the head, again, just to add more color, more color and more variation to the fur. I apologize too if my voice sounds a little rough, but I've been pretty sick for about a week now, and I'm only just starting to sound like myself again. Okay, so I'm going to X that texture out, and I'm going to choose a light pink color for my brush. And I just want to lightly paint on the inside of the ear. Just to give it a little bit of a, like a I don't want to paint over the fur texture completely, but I do want it to look like a little bit of that skin is being shown through. So something like that looks pretty good. And now what do we have left? We have the nose and we have the claws. Let's do the claws really quickly because that will be really easy to do and really fast. I'm just going to select a brown color for my brush. And I have, again, just like the teeth, I have all of the claws unwrapped together in one area. So I can just paint over all of them really quickly. And I've chosen a brown color for the claws, but again, later when we do our materials, we'll probably separate the claws and give them a material of their own and make them a little translucent, so they won't look so flat and dry and brown. They'll look a little more like claws should, hopefully. Now I'm going to use my face selection and just select all of the pads on the hands and the feet. And if you've never used this masking before, it basically works just like anything in edit mode. Right now, I'm using the C key, which is the selection tool, to select the faces. You can also use A to select everything and then A again to deselect everything. If you hover over an object that has seams, you can use the L key to select any area of the mesh that's marked off by seams. So basically it works just like edit mode. This is probably the most tedious part of texture painting this model, is selecting these faces on the bottoms of the hands and feet. We'll probably add some bump map to these as well. Maybe like a cracked skin texture or something. We'll see what we can find on CG Textures. Okay, so now all of those faces are selected. And now I'm just going to paint over them. And provided that you have the faces selected on both sides, you only need to paint on one, and it will show up on both sides. Okay, now so we'll do the feet. The feet will be a little easier to select, I think. So I'll just speed through this part. Okay, so I think everything is done now except for the nose. And the thing that makes the nose different than the rest of the mesh is that it's the only part of the mesh that we're going to paint some detail onto that won't be covered by fur. So, you don't have to paint any detail. You could make the nose all one color. But I think I'm going to put a little bit of variation in it. So I'm going to use my face masking, just select everything with A, and then deselect the nose so that I can just paint on it. And I'll start with a sort of a deep reddish pink color, almost like a rose color. That'll be the base color. The reason it doesn't look like the paint goes all the way to the edge of the UVs is because the subsurf modifier. So the original geometry looks, it's that big and boxy UV, but the subsurf pulls everything together. So you want to make sure that you do paint outside of the original UVs. Okay, so now I'm going to maybe select like a bit of a darker color. And I'm going to go around the outer border. Okay. So now the outside of the nose is a little dark, and the front faces of the nose are a little lighter. I can also paint in those faces that we did the Alt P, the poke tool. Um, I can give a little more of a hint of a shadow by just painting a little bit of a dark color in there. Okay, so now I'll lighten the color up a little so that I can put some highlights in it. And I'll run up the center and then just come along the top ridge of the nose. My opacity is pretty low too, so it's going to show all of the colors underneath. I'm just basically putting on layers. So now I've switched to the smudge brush. And I'm just going to run everything together a little and soften it up. And again, it's going to get a little bit of a bump map too. So that will be a little more extra detail as well. So once you're happy with your texture and your model, you want to make sure that you save that image somewhere. Because if you quit Blender and reopen it, it will not have saved that texture. So, okay. So what we need to do now is we need to create another texture. This texture is for the character itself, but we need to create another texture for the hair. And the reason is because, you know, if a hair particle emits from an area around the nose, then it might actually take the texture from the nose. So you would have these pink hair strands around the nose, which is not ideal. So you want to just select the hair color closest to those areas and just paint over them. So we'll paint over the nose and the claws, and also the pads on the bottom of the hands and feet, and also the areas in the ear that we painted pink. I'm just going to apply like maybe a different, maybe just like the white, lighter fur texture. So that way you would get a little more variation there. What we don't want is just, you know, again, the nose is the most important area because you really don't want those large pink hair strands coming from the nose. It would be very obvious. And when you're done, make sure that you just save that one to a different name. We'll just call this one character hair. And that is the end of this tutorial, I think. We'll, in the next one, probably start on the vertex groups and maybe even get to starting on the hair as well. But thanks again for watching, guys, and I will see you in the next tutorial.